5 and 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
The workshop for June 23rd, 2015 is now in session. Mrs. Henderson is unable to join us for the workshop portion of this meeting. However, she will join us by phone when the special meeting is convened. Pam, roll call, please.
Mr. Craig?
Present.
Mrs. Belford?
Present.
Mr. Ziegler?
Present.
Mrs. Nisi?
Here.
Mrs. Henderson?
Michelle Irwin, Director of Community Relations, will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Please rise.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We are going to begin with the topic of equity in education, behavioral supports, and Brevard. Following the conclusion of this item, we will recess the board workshop and convene the special school board meeting at 10 a.m. After the special meeting is adjourned, we will reconvene the board workshop for the preliminary budget and millage levy portion and an EDR update. Dr. Bingley, will you please do the honors on this, your last board workshop in Brevard?
I'm sorry. And I messed it up. Sorry. Yes, Ms. Nisi and members of the board, at this time I would like to ask for Donna Boberski, Director of Exceptional Education Program Support, to come forward and make the introductions. And Dr. Boberski, you're ahead of me. You're already there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you get Pam?
Good morning, Mrs. Nisi.
Oh, we're fine.
Good
Go
morning,
ahead.
ma-
I was just...
Yeah, that's okay. Good morning, members of the board, and good morning, Dr. Bingley. Thank you so much for letting us be here this morning to present to you on equity in education, specifically behavioral and disciplinary supports for our students in Brevard Public Schools. It is my honor today to have our student services team here with us, and leading us is our wonderful leader, Assistant Superintendent Dr. Beth Eddy. We also have with us today Jason Lobley, a certified behavior analyst who leads positive behavior support. We have Dr. Tommy Kasango, one of our school psychologists and ground floor implementer of positive behavior support in our schools. We have with us also Melissa Katakis, Director of Students at Risk, and Jeanette Ransom, our coordinator for Students at Risk, and Terry Keim, who is a project coordinator. We also have the pleasure of a special guest today, Dr. Stephanie Martinez from University of South Florida. Our goals this morning are fairly simple. We have 3 objectives. The first is to increase our knowledge around the issue of disproportionate discipline practices in the state and in our district, to become aware of state-level resources and processes to address disproportionate discipline, and to increase knowledge of positive behavior support and become aware of state-level resources to support its implementation in Brevard Public Schools. It is my pleasure now to introduce Jason Lobley, our certified behavior analyst who has grown cultural diversity and positive behavior support in Brevard Public Schools.
Good morning, Mrs. Nisi. Good morning, board. Good morning, Dr. Bingley. I have the pleasure of introducing our special guest this morning, Dr. Stephanie Martinez. She works for Florida's Positive Behavior Support Project at the University of South Florida. The Florida's PBS project provides training and technical assistance around positive behavior support and multi-tiered systems of support for behavior for school districts across the state of Florida. This is a grant-funded project by the Bureau of Exceptional Education and Student Services out of Florida's Department of Education. As a member of the project, she provides training and technical assistance to 10 school districts and supports 3 districts in their efforts to address disproportionate discipline. She has her doctorate degree in curriculum and instruction with specialization in special education and an educational leadership certification. Prior to working on Florida's Positive Behavior Support Project, she was a middle school teacher for students with disabilities that also had behavioral concerns. So I introduce to you Dr. Stephanie Martinez.
Good morning, Mrs. Nisi. Good morning, board. Good morning, Dr. Bingley. As Jason said, I work for the Positive Behavior Support Project at the University of South Florida in Tampa, and we are working on both positive behavior support, and the goal of our PBS project is to build the capacity of Brevard County to support students around behavior and discipline issues across the 3 tiers of systems of support. What our project does is we provide training and technical assistance to the school districts free of charge around the 3 tiers of positive behavior support. In addition, we have some additional work groups that I'll discuss in a minute, specifically around disproportionality. So when I reference the multi-tiered systems of support, there's 3 tiers of support to address behavior and social-emotional development for students in schools. The first tier is for everybody at the school site, and approximately 80% of students should be receiving those supports or having access to those supports. We know about 15 to 20% of the student population, despite having those supports in place for the entire school, will need some additional supports. That's where we look at providing more intensive supports at the Tier 2 level, and that's for about 15% of the school population. They will need those services, and those are received through small group interventions. Then about 5% of the students, despite having those interventions and supports, will need some additional, more intensive services, and that's where that Tier 3 comes in place. That's where we start doing some more individualized behavior intervention plans, and that's where we have a lot of the services provided by the behavior analysts here in the district. Last school year, there was a very competitive grant that came out of the Department of Education in DC. There was both the School Climate Transformation Grant, which was both for local education agencies and state education agencies. Brevard County was one of the school districts here in the state of Florida that applied for that grant. Unfortunately, this district did not receive it this last school year. The Department of Ed is now reviewing those grants from last school year, and there's a possibility that Brevard will get it for this next school year. Despite the fact that the local education agency did not get that grant, the state did. Because of that, the money went from BES, or the Bureau of Exceptional Education Student Services, through USF to our grant to do some additional works besides positive behavior support. So those items highlighted in red are the different things that our grant is working on in addition to PBS. One of those is a classroom coaching guide. So that is a tool that we're working with schools to assist classroom teachers with classroom management. So there are points and times, and sometimes our teachers need some additional supports with the behaviors in the classroom, and that's what the goal of that project is. Brevard County is one of the districts in the state of Florida that is participating in that, and will be starting in September of the 2015-2016 school year. Another one of those is the collaboration around disproportionality. We started working in January here in the district to address disproportionality discipline, specifically for students who are being suspended at a greater rate than other students by ethnicity and disability. So we're going to be providing some continued supports around that. In addition to that, I know that Brevard County did receive some other grants and initiatives to address disproportionality. I'm going to have Melissa Skatejas talk about those right now.
Hi, good morning, Mrs. Nisi, members of the board, Dr. Bingley. Last summer, the Office of Students at Risk applied for a grant through the National Institute of School Justice, and we were awarded this grant. It's a 3-year project. It is designed to improve school climate and safety and we focused on the Cocoa feeder chain schools, Cocoa High, Saturn, Cambridge, Endeavor, and Emma Jewell. Through the implementation of mental health training for school personnel, and mental health services, including social workers for students and families, we are hoped that this project will be successful and that we can apply for an extension and replicate this project at other schools throughout the district. In addition, we also, last year, our team from Students at Risk worked closely with school-based administrators throughout the district who are in charge of discipline. Last year, after our annual district-wide training for school-based administrators overseeing discipline at all our schools, they were asked to submit discipline action plans. This was done to encourage administrators to monitor discipline data through AS400 and Performance Matters, to identify their areas of concerns, and to put in place interventions to address these problems. Throughout the year, our team visited schools throughout the county to discuss discipline data and interventions that were working. Examples of interventions schools are using are programs called daily pop checks, where administrators walk into a classroom and just look to see if Dress code is in place, student behavior is in place, students are on time to class. Passport reward system, refocus activities, check-in and check-out programs, character education, mentoring, in-school suspension programs that include a strong counseling and reflection component, outreach and mentoring from community members to support anger management, interventions and supports for incoming ninth graders, and Love and Logic programs at some of our elementary schools. This year at our discipline training, which is scheduled for September 18th, we will compile all of these interventions and strategies that we collected during these visits and share those with administrators in hopes that they can implement some of these at their schools for next year. Thank you.
To continue on, part of the state education grant for school climate transformation has some other work projects that we're working on. One of those is redesigning the Tier 3 system, those functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans for students. So that way we have a system in place that actually uses the data to drive the decision-making around providing supports for students. So seeing how many students are being successful with the implementation of the supports and what we can do to continue that success. And then for those students who are not being successful with those additional supports, what can we do to help them? The last one, which is dealing with restraint and seclusion for students with disabilities, specifically here in Brevard County, reducing the number of rates for students who are being restrained, and that's for students with disabilities. So as you can see, these are some of the different active work groups that we have that Brevard County is participating in red. One of the additional things at the bottom that I'll highlight is the RTIB database, which I've not talked about, but that's a data system where schools can use it to track behavior across the 3 tiers and use it for progress monitoring to see how schools are doing so they can use the data for decision making. And it's an additional database that the schools do have to double entry, but the data that they are provided allows them to make snapshot decisions based on the graphs that are available to them. The other one on the very bottom is not something that comes necessarily out of the school climate transformation grant for the SEA, but here in Brevard County there is the work group going on right now looking at the student code of conduct, overhauling it and seeing what needs to be addressed to look at addressing disproportionality. So here are some data. As I mentioned, we are really data driven. So when we look at the districts that we work with, we collect data from them 3 times a year. I'll focus specifically one at the end of the year is we ask the schools to report back to us their rates of in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, and rates of office discipline referrals. What we do as a project then is for the schools that are participating in PBS, we break it down by schools that are implementing with high fidelity versus those schools that are implementing with lower fidelity, because as with any intervention, if you're not doing the full program, you're probably not going to see the benefits that you want to see. So this is Brevard's data, and you can see across the years that there's been schools that have increased with their fidelity over time. Each school year, we've added schools on board. It's a voluntary process to go through the tier PBS training. So we just recently 2 weeks ago trained some additional schools, so the numbers fluctuate from school to school year, but what you do notice is that there continues to be a difference with schools using rates of out-of-school suspension for those who are implementing PBS with fidelity versus those who are not fully implementing at this time. That was Brevard's data. I also wanted to show you, because it usually comes up, well, how do we compare to the rest of the state? So you can see where the data is for the rest of the state. We have 67 school districts that we're working with in the state of Florida that are reporting the outcomes to us. For this data is for all school districts, including Brevard County's data. Again, it's broken down by rates of those implementing with high fidelity versus those implementing with low fidelity. The rates are compared per 100 students so that we can compare across school districts and across schools by taking into account that different student populations at different schools. The issue of disproportionality is not something that's just here in Brevard County. It's not just an issue here in the state of Florida, but it's becoming an issue nationwide. And so there's been a lot more attention paid to it. One of the biggest things that we know, too, is that the student populations are becoming more and more diverse, and that our student populations that are of minorities are becoming more increasingly, and to the point where it's outnumbering our non-white students, or white students, excuse me. So back in January of 2014, the U.S. Department of Education did what they wrote, a Dear Colleague letter. If you've never seen one of those before, this is just a letter that is sent out across the nation to all educators stating the fact that they're aware that there is a lot of disproportionality occurring across the nation, specifically as it relates to disciplinary issues. So in this letter, it was asking school districts, schools, and teachers to really say, this is an area that we need to focus on. It's an area of concern. In addition to the letter, they did provide some additional resources about strategies to address disproportionality. It's a huge issue, but there's not a lot of research behind it to say that if you have disproportionality issues around discipline, this is what you need to do to fix it. They just gave some recommended strategies, and there's still a lot of research that needs to be done to say, yes, these are the things that can address disproportionality. So when we look at the Brevard suspension rate, you can see there's two comparisons here. There's the percent of students in Brevard County broken down by race for the student population. That's really important because what we can see on the left-hand side is that our African American males for this last school year made up 15% of our student population in the district. However, they made up about 35% of students who received out-of-school suspensions. So when you're looking at discipline data that way, really about 15% of our students who are African American or Black should be receiving out-of-school suspension, where there's 35%. So there is a greater risk if you are an African American male to be suspended more frequently than your subparts. This is just one source of data that you can look at. The state also looks at other things like risk ratio, student composition, and there's lots of different measures. But this one is the one that really stands out as to there's an issue. Not unlike Brevard County, but if you look at the state of Florida as a general, how do you compare? Again, Florida is actually the #1 in the nation for suspending students who are African American and male, and also third for those who suspended white males as well. So there's a lot of use of out-of-school suspension for our students. What does that mean when students are receiving those out-of-school suspension? There's been a lot of research done that shows the more we suspend students, there's that school-to-prison pipeline, and the more we suspend students increases the likelihood that they're not going to graduate from school, they're going to drop out of school and end up in prison as early as 3rd grade. So it's something that we really need to put some preventative strategies in place to address those things. And so these are just 3 news articles from here locally in the state of Florida saying that it's a big concern and that the school districts need to be doing something about it. So because one of the impacts from out-of-school suspension is decreased graduation rates, this is the data for Brevard County. Again, it's taking the graduation rates from Brevard County, breaking it down by subgroup, and you will see consistently the students that are in Brevard County that are African American or Black have reduced rates of graduation on time. And you can see this has been consistently a pattern since 2009-2010 school year. There was a slight increase back up to the 2012-2013 school year at 80%, but where is that in comparison to the rest of the district? There's still that significant gap, and then there was a decrease for the 13-14 school year. How do you compare across the state? If you look at Florida's on-time graduation rate means that the students who started in 9th grade completed high school in 4 years, so on time, in their cohort. You see the very similar trends that the students who are Black and or African American are not graduating at the same rate as our other counterparts in the state of Florida. So what we know nationally is that these issues have been going on for a long time. It's nothing new. But there's been such an increase with the media. There's an increase from supports from USDOE, there's increase from supports from the state, and there's increase from supports from grant-funded projects to help districts to address this issue. And one of the big things that concerns me is when students are being removed from school, they're missing that academic time, and they're getting further and further behind, which again has those different impacts on graduation. So this is really kind of hard to read, but I'll give you an example of what this looks at. This looks at the number of referrals that was processed at one of the schools here in Brevard County. It says there's an estimated amount of 30 minutes for an administrator to process that referral, and 15 minutes for students who are missing class. So that's just an average. We know that sometimes when students are sent to the office, it's for more of a minor issue like a classroom disruption, which takes less time to process and handle than it does, say, for example, if 2 students are engaged in a physical aggression or a fight. But it's an average out, and this just shows you, as a result, how much time is lost, both administrator time, but also student instructional time. So if we can reduce the number of times that students have to go to the office, then they're going to be increasing their amount of instructional time. And the way we want to do that is by putting prevention strategies in place. Not that we want to say that we don't want to send students to the office. If it warrants a referral, they still need to go to the office. But what are some things that our classroom teachers can do to manage behaviors in their classroom? It doesn't have to result in going to the office. So doing a lot of prevention strategies, teaching the behaviors we want to see, and reinforcing our students. This is just another example from a school here in Brevard County and the amount of time that they gained by reducing the rates of discipline to the office. Now, for addressing disproportionality, and I know that's one of the reasons we're here, is to look at a process to make some changes here in Brevard County. So the first step is doing data review, and that's currently where we are in the district. We've gone through and looked at the risk ratio for out-of-school suspensions for every school here in the district. We've looked at it by race. We looked at it by free and reduced lunch status, and we've also looked at it for students with disabilities. And from there, we've narrowed it down to potentially 9 schools that we want to work with. And the next step is really to do some further data digging with those schools, because what we need to find is, why is it an issue at each school? It's not going to be the same reason across all the schools. It may be a reason because there's not good family-community relationships, teacher-student relationships. At another school, it might be because of their discipline policies and procedures. At another school, it might be that there's not culturally relevant education around social-emotional development going on. So we want to work with those schools to identify why it's a problem, and using a 4-step problem-solving process. And then from there, each school will develop their own action plan. I know Melissa talked about those action plans. And then going back and working with the schools to monitor their implementation, continue to collect the data and see where their progress is going, and just making sure it works. So some of the benefits of working with the USF project on this disproportionality is that because we are funded by the state, and it's an issue that the state is really addressing and looking at, we're totally committed to following through with this throughout the entire school year, and as it's a need for the district. We have the ability to get additional resources and information about both across the state, but we have some connections with a technical assistance center for positive behavior interventions and support, and it's a big issue they're working on well. So as new research is coming out, we're able to get that information and disseminate it and figure out how to work that into the schools here in the county. So some of the district responsibilities that we ask for the district is to have a district leadership team that has decision-making powers, has community representative and membership on it to lead and drive those efforts. And so we've met with that team already. As I mentioned, we're already looking at the data, and that should be a data sharing process so that we can help with the problem solving. And then our goal is to build the capacity of that district team to continue that work with additional schools as we move forward. So what are we going to do as a PBS project? One, I already mentioned, we're going to look at the data. The next is we're going to help with problem solving and action planning. We have a staff that's been very well trained in the problem solving process and helping to address barriers and action planning needs and evaluation as it comes across. We will provide any training and technical assistance as needed for the schools, and if it's not something that our project can provide, there are other discretionary projects we can work with as needed if needed. So for example, Fiddlers, SEDNet are some of those other discretionary projects, and just continue providing ongoing support as needed. So these are the districts that we're working with here in the state of Florida as a PBS project. There's about 7 right now that are addressing the disproportionality issue. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I've been talking a lot about the disproportionality piece of our project, but the other part of our project is positive behavior support. Across the 3 tiers related to multi-systems of support. Within the 3 tiers, it doesn't matter which tier you're talking about, but these are the core principles of positive behavior support. Having a team that leads and drives the process, it doesn't matter which tier that we're talking about, they're action planning and they're continuing to use their data to make decisions and revise and update that action plan based on what's going on at their school. The other thing we also want to emphasize is the prevention, teaching, and consequences. Those are the interventions that we want schools to do. So up front, we want them to identify the structures of their school that need support. So every school is a little bit differently because they can meet it to the context of their individual school, whether it's a difference in demographics, grade level, different parts of the county. Put some prevention strategies in place. So what can we do to prevent the problem behavior from happening in the first place? So that's our ultimate goal, is to see students who have good social, emotional, and behavioral development. However, there are times when even though we have those prevention strategies in place, students will need the teaching. Sometimes kids come in and they don't have the skills that are necessary for school, for social, emotional development, so we need to teach that behaviors that we see. And then if the students are meeting our expectations, we need to reinforce them and say, you are doing a good job of being safe or being respectful and being responsible. But despite having those prevention, teaching, and positive reinforcements, there's going to be times where kids still do break the rules. They do not meet our expectations. And in those instances, we need to have a good, solid policies and processes in place for how to handle that. Is it something that the teacher can work with on the classroom and put interventions in place? Or is it something that's so outrageous that it needs to go to the office and needs to be handled by the office and provided discipline procedures up there? So these are the three parts of it. We really want to emphasize the prevention and teaching piece of it because we want to try and curb the behavior before it actually stops, so there's no need to go to the office. But if it does go, it does go. And what are those good strategies we're going to put in place so that hopefully the child doesn't repeat that same behavior again and doesn't need to go to the office? As part of our positive behavior support project, one of the things that we require as a core leadership principle is that leadership piece. We require that each district has what we call a yearly implementation plan. We come out, we meet with a district leadership team, we review your district data. From there, we develop a plan that has both 3-year goals, 1-year goals, and action steps to drive our decisions throughout the school year. As I mentioned, it's required for every single district, but the district decides what that plan is and what it looks like so it meets the context of your school district. Throughout the year, I work with Jason Lobley directly, and we go through that action plan several times a year and update it and see where the status of the district is and if there's additional supports that are needed. That action plan will drive the different trainings and technical assistance that we provide to the district. When we develop that plan, this is a blueprint that comes out of the OSEP Technical Assistance Center from Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, in which this just shows is that when we develop that plan, we need to address all these different elements. It doesn't matter which type of intervention or that you're putting in place. Different initiatives, you need to have all of these things with the exception of maybe behavioral expertise. If you're talking about a math initiative, you probably need to change that to math. Otherwise, these are the things that we know in order to implement with fidelity and sustain the initiative over time. So this is just kind of a summary of the breakdown for the 3-year goals that were developed here in Brevard County this last school year when we developed that plan. So some of the key things here I just want to point out is the implementation of fidelity of Tier 1, addressing those rates of disproportionality, and that goes back to that school climate, maintaining or increasing letter grades, ensuring consistency across campuses. And what that really means is making sure that all campuses have a consistent discipline policies, procedures, and processes, and that those are being implemented with fidelity as they've defined them. Using data for problem solving, looking at that Tier 3 process as well. So our project provides multiple types of training and technical assistance to districts across the state. The districts have the ability to select and pick what they need, and this is driven by that district action plan that we do every year. So some of the things that Brevard County has been accessing over the last several years is that school-wide training. 2 weeks ago, we trained some additional schools on Tier 1. Then we also have booster training. What we find sometimes is that schools here in the state of Florida have a lot of turnover, both with administration and with teachers. So over time, schools may need to be boosted or refreshed about what PBS looks like, because as we get new people in who haven't received training, there may be some misunderstandings and miscommunications, so we want to clear that up. But it also gives the schools a time to action plan and develop and make changes based on the changes for their school. We also do classroom, as I mentioned, we have that new classroom coaching guide that we're going to be working with here in September in Brevard County. Targeted group or Tier 2, we trained several schools last week to do that. Those are schools that are implementing Tier 1 with fidelity and are ready to tackle and address students who need Tier 2 supports, so that small group. Some of the other things that we do is we have coaches here in Brevard County for every single school. Some of them are what we call internal coaches, and some of them are external coaches. Dr. Tommy Kasango is what we call an external coach. He's a school psychologist. And so we provide the training every year for new coaches as they come on board. Then additionally, Jason meets with those coaches throughout the school year to provide them ongoing supports and assistance. There's been a lot of research that shows that training does not necessarily translate into implementation unless you have that coaching piece in place. So we really strongly believe that to train a school and get them to continue with implementation with fidelity, they need those coaching supports. So here's just some data showing the effectiveness of positive behavior support in schools, and I'm not going to read it to you, but you can see that there has been some improvements both in the state and nationally for schools that have implemented positive behavior support, and decreases in rates of office discipline referrals and out-of-school suspension. And here are those references if you want some further information about those datas. This is our project contact information. I know that you have in front of you some additional resources that have been provided. One of them is the Tier 1 training curriculum. So if you've got more questions about the curriculum, what the teachers go through, you can review that binder as well.
Good morning, Ms. Sinisi. Good morning, board members. Good morning, Dr. Bingley. My name is Tommy Kasango, and I'm a psychologist here with the district. And as Dr. Martinez says, I'm an external PBS coach. The majority of the coaches in the district are people that work in the school system. 2 years ago, O'Galley High School approached me, I'm their school psychologist, and asked if I would be their coach at their school for the 2013-14 school year. So I accepted that, and going into that, my background as a school psychologist, I was able to really target what PBS is all about. A lot of times the schools need that Tier 1 training, and again, they had their first year, they need a little bit of a booster. We attended the booster, and at that point I was able to get in, look at their data, and work with their team leader and to actually look at what's going on. One of the things as an itinerant, I serve other schools in the district who also are implementing PBS, and I serve schools who aren't in the PBS project yet. Seeing both sides of it, I'm able to actually see in the trenches what is working and what isn't. The data that was shown actually shows the higher implementing schools are the ones that are reducing their office discipline referrals as well as their out-of-school suspension rate. And at O'Galley, we were able to target exactly where their concerns were and be able to address that and reduce that this particular school year. I don't know if you have any particular questions for me that I could address, but I'd be more than happy to answer it as far as someone that actually works out in the schools for the project.
Questions?
Thank you.
Andy, I know you do have.
I want to thank the board members for giving us the opportunity to give you a very quick flyover of some of the things we're doing in our district to help address discipline issues. Teachers have to be able to teach their content. They have to have kids in their classrooms who are engaged and ready to learn. In order to do that, students actually have to be present. So my office, through Melissa Katakis, works on attendance because when kids are absent, they're not learning. And when they come back, sometimes that's where problems are started. So we are looking at all aspects of behavior in a classroom so that teachers can actually teach the curriculum. Our teachers, our goal is to support our teachers through our division better with discipline strategies so that they can manage their classrooms and teach. And I know that's what your goal is as well. And this was just a very quick overview of some of the projects we have going on in our division. I want to thank Dr. Stephanie Martinez from USF for coming here today and explaining. She's been a great partner for us with positive behavior support. And as she said, we're working on a school climate and transformation grant, and although we applied for that grant and did not receive it, we were lucky enough to be pulled in under USF's grant. The opportunities of working with a research institution like USF really makes a difference for our county because we can access so many more resources and support our schools in so many other ways. So I wanted to thank you for allowing us this time this morning to share with you the projects that we have going on. I know that was very, very fast, but we are available for questions. I have my whole team here if you'd like to ask any kinds of questions.
I know Mr. Ziegler has several questions, so I'm going to turn it over to him.
That's fine.
Interesting data. Data can be taken a lot of different ways. I was hoping that we were going to hear what is PBS, not data on specifics, on discipline, on referrals, and all that stuff, but the meat of PBS. And the reason that I'd really like to know that is, and because this board needs to decide if we like this, whether it's the right direction. Because personally, I've been hearing out there a lot of different comments from teachers and staff on really whether this is working, whether it's the holy grail for solving our problems. And I'm actually even more dismayed at seeing PBS in the title of a solution for district-wide discipline, because from what I understand, of course, until you maybe explain the meat of how it works, this is just one of our tools in our quiver for solving the problem of discipline. So before I even get into other questions, I'd like if somebody could give us a little overview of how does PBS actually work, because I think it's only one part of the solution.
It is definitely only one part of the solution, and as you notice, not all of our schools are engaged in it. It has to, the engagement in PBS has to come as a total faculty buy-in before you can really implement with fidelity. But I'll have Dr. Martinez explain exactly what PBS is, and so she can give you that answer to that question.
I'll start with the fact that, as Dr. Thuddy said, it's completely voluntary. So we've got Jason here, who's what as we call our district coordinator. If a school is interested in implementing positive behavior support, they contact him about the process. Part of that process is first getting the schools ready. That requires that the school leadership team, one, is developed, and that's a good representative of their campus. So they have a broad representation of staff on their teams, from instructional to non-instructional staff, variety of grade levels, content area, depending upon the school. As part of that process, too, we ask that a presentation is provided to the entire faculty, giving them an overview of what PBS is and if they're interested in implementation and taking a vote. We say that in order for an initiative to take place, there needs to be that faculty buy-in, and that vote allows us to know where the school staff is. We say that about 80% of faculty and staff want to do this in order for it to be successful. A school may not start at 80% buy-in, but that's what our ultimate goal is. Once they complete that, then they go through what we call a Tier 1 training. It's a 3-day training where they bring that entire team. It's very intensive. We spend 3 days talking about the 10 elements of PBS, and they develop an action plan. Part of that action plan is to go back and train their faculty and staff and to get buy-in. So the 10 elements of PBS are, one is teaming. So they develop that team. Each person on the team takes on roles and responsibilities, from a team leader and a coach, as Dr. Kami Kasanga is, to a data person, a behavior expertise person, and administrator. So just a couple samples from there. From that team, then they develop what we call school-wide expectations and rules. So the school-wide expectations are broad behaviors of how we want our students to behave on campus. So be safe, be respectful, be responsible, be a problem solver. And the schools develop that based on their individual school basis and what they think their needs are, but they also look at their discipline data to say, what are those things we've typically struggled with on our campus? Has it been kids who are not being responsible, so they're not being prepared for school, they're not in dress code? Maybe it's they're not being respectful to teachers or respectful to one another or to the school campus. From there, they develop rules for specific settings. So they, based on the data, identify the settings that are most problematic. So is it the hallway, the cafeteria, the bathroom, the bus? What are those areas that are problematic? And then they develop 3 to 5 positively stated rules to address the problems that they're seeing in those specific settings. So whatever the issues are in the cafeteria, they need to come up with rules to address them. The next piece of that is teaching the behaviors that we want to see for our students. So once we identify that we want our students to be safe, be respectful, be responsible, what does that look like on our school campus? So they're to spend some time teaching the behaviors that they would want to see from those students under being safe, be respectful, be responsible. We also ask them to then take time to teach the rules that we have in our cafeteria, or the hallway, or the bathroom, wherever they've developed those rules, because schools differ from school to school. As our kids are coming into our schools at the very beginning of the school year, we need to make sure that they understand these are the rules and the behaviors that are expected on our campus, and then continue to do that throughout the school year as we have new students who come on board. As the school year goes on, sometimes our students forget and are not behaving appropriately, so it's an opportunity to reteach. We ask the schools to look at their data to identify the months that are most problematic so they can go back and reteach. So those are some of those preventative things that we ask schools to do. Another piece of that is a positive reinforcement part. So when students are meeting the expectations, they are following the rules on their campus, they're getting some positive feedback saying, yes, you are meeting those behavioral standards, you are doing what is expected of you. Because sometimes we forget that piece. We're so focused on what kids are not doing that we forgot when kids are doing the right thing to tell them that they are doing the right thing. That helps them with self-monitoring their behavior. Even though we have those pieces in place, then we spend a good chunk of time talking about the discipline policies and processes. So the first thing we need to do is, as a school, develop what we call definitions for appropriate behavior, or definitions for behavior. We have office discipline referral forms. On your forms, you have things like disruption, disrespect, insubordination. What does that exactly mean? What are those behaviors that are coded under those terms? Because they are kind of vague. The school then comes up with good concrete definitions that are observable, measurable, so that everybody on campus is consistent with those definitions. Another part of that is then also identifying for our specific campus what behavior should teachers be able to handle in the classroom versus those things that need to go to the office. So things like our CESR incidents, so our school environmental safety indicator reports, things like drugs, weapons. Those are things that definitely go to the office. They have state guidelines for what you have to do for those behaviors. But when there's other behaviors like aggression, inappropriate language, who handles that behavior, and then providing them some strategies on how to address that behavior. So if I'm a classroom teacher and I have a student who's using some profanity in my classroom, what do? Well, if it's something that we've decided as it's a minor behavior because the student's using profanity because they stubbed their toe, here's some different interventions that teacher can try, which is a little bit different than if the student is up using profanity towards the adult, then the student does go to the office, and what are some different interventions that the office can try to address that behavior. So there's those parts of it. It's not only defining it and identifying the things we want teachers to handle, and that's a team doing this. And we always say when the team develops this, it's a draft and they want to go back and get their faculty buy-in. So when they're going back, they're saying, this is a draft of what we've come up with. They ask the rest of their teachers to give some feedback and make those changes based on the feedback. We also provide interventions. So here's, as a classroom teacher, here's some different interventions that you can try in the classroom. If a student goes to the office, these are the different things that the administration in the office can handle, and then building in that communication piece. From there, we talk about a referral process. So now that I've observed a behavior, I need to figure out what is that process. If the student does go to the office, how do I get the student to the office? Do I write the referral and send it down with the child? Do I write it and I call the administration to come remove the child from my classroom? What does that process look like on our school campus? Again, because they differ from school to school. Then the last couple pieces are data, and it's a data-driven process, so we're always going back and looking at our data. Some of our schools indicate that their first year of implementation, they actually notice an increase in office discipline referrals because they're actually tracking the behaviors. They're actually tracking things in the past that they would not address. So for example, we've had schools who say issues with dress code, tardies, which are more minor behaviors, but they really started tracking it and realized that there was a significant issue on campus and they needed to address it and put some interventions in place. After that data piece, we talk about classroom systems and ongoing evaluation. So there's 10 elements really that encompass PBS. And when I mentioned fidelity earlier, in order for a school to be implementing PBS with fidelity, they need to have all 10 elements in place and ongoing and making revisions throughout the school year and from school year to school year. What happens, unfortunately, you have schools get trained and they pick parts of PBS to implement and they don't do all of it. So those schools with lower fidelity are for one of two reasons. They've received training and they're a brand new school and they're trying to get this up and running, and it takes about good 3 to 5 years to get all 3 tiers in place. Or they received training and they have not gone back and implemented the entire piece of it, and they don't have an intention to because they're struggling for other reasons. So I hope that gives you a nice overview of what the 10 elements are of PBS. Additional questions?
That helps a little. I think one of the things that myself as a board member and probably parents want to know is, and you touched on it slightly, is when Johnny does something disrespectful, what is the ramifications? And the reason that I'm concerned about that is I've heard from teachers out there in PBS schools that, oh, well, they can't send the kid to the office until they've had a repeat offenses. You know, so, you know, Johnny throws the eraser at the teacher, and they get, you know, don't do that again. And well, after being beamed off the head 3 times, well, okay, now they could send them. You know, I don't see how that's going to solve the problem. So I guess, as you said, there's a list of actions and reactions to the child's behavior. But then I guess I would like to know other board members' thoughts about, so you said it's the school themselves set up their rules. So now you're telling me that discipline can be different from school to school. And I'm not sure, not being an expert in that area, I'm not sure if I agree with that or not, other than maybe different schools have different cultural requirements. Maybe that justifies that?
There's different cultural requirements, but there's also different ways the schools are set up. So if you have a school that's, say, 2 levels, they might need to have different rules in the hallway because they're a 2-level school versus a school that's 1 level. It also may change slightly by the age of the students. High school students may have different behavioral issues than elementary school, so you're going to want to have rules that address the needs of the elementary school versus the high school. Different schools have kids bringing different issues to campus. You know, some high schools say they have a huge issue with technology. Other schools say we don't have an issue with technology, so that school may not need to address the technology because they don't have issues. Whereas another school that's having problems with technology would definitely want to have some expectations and rules around that because they're having issues with technology and the kids using it. So it really meets the context of what's going on that school campus, and that's one of the things that schools like about it, because there is that flexibility to address this particular needs of that school, because the needs change from school to school.
Okay, and also want to touch on disproportionality. There's perceptions of disproportionality. Could you speak a little to why there's a disproportionality and what you actually compare to validate the perception of disproportionality? Because I don't like that some people think it's staff maybe being unfair one way or the other, when I think there are a lot of other causes for that disproportionality.
When we look at disproportionality, look at multiple sources of data. One was up here that I showed you, which was the comparison of student population demographics to the student population that's receiving those out-of-school suspensions. The research states that it should be 1-to-1. So 15% of your population is one ethnicity group, they should be getting 15% of the referrals or out-of-school suspensions. But there's not. There's that imbalance there. Another way to look at it is risk ratio, which is taking that and calculating it into a formula. So the risk ratio says that one subgroup is 1 times more likely to get a disciplinary action than the other group. That's really what you want. But when we break it down, there were several schools here in the school district that had over 2.5 times. So if I'm a student who is Hispanic at one school, I may be 2.5 more times likely to get a referral than another student. Now, the causes to it are multifaceted. There's not one reason behind it. So when we looked at the research that came out with a Dear Colleague letter, we broke it down, and some of the issues are the curriculum is not culturally relevant to the student population sometimes. Sometimes the instructional strategies we use do not meet the learning needs of all students. So if we have someone who's up there lecturing for 45 minutes out of a 15-minute block, is that appropriate for our middle school students? Do we need to do some interactions within the students' response and call, choral responding, some engaging activities? Awareness is sometimes, even as adults, when we're in the heat of the moment, sometimes we make snap decisions. And so with the awareness piece is taking a step back and thinking, for this individual student, are there some cultural differences between us? But also for that individual student, did they know what the expectations and rules were? And sometimes they don't. We've had students here in the state of Florida that have been 6, 7 different schools in one entire school year. And if I'm coming into your school in maybe, say, October, I've not been taught what the rules are for that particular campus, and it's my 4th school for this school year. And so I really don't know what's expected. So I'm just going by what my previous experience has been at the other school or a different school, or maybe even a different school in a different district. So sometimes it's when those behaviors occur, we need to, I think, stop and think. We tell our students to stop and think. As adults, stop and think about the student's behavior. Were they aware of it? Do we need to maybe do some teaching piece first? And maybe there's not. But it's that awareness piece of where is the student coming from, where are we coming from, and is there some mismatch before we apply a disciplinary issue. Some of the other reasons might be there's not good relationships between the staff and the students, so we need to build that relationships. But sometimes it's not between the staff and the students. Sometimes it's between the staff at the school and the relationship with the community and the families. And there's that gap that needs to be bridged. There's maybe some misunderstanding between school and home about what the behaviors are that are accepted. Maybe there's differences at home and at school for what behaviors are tolerated, and so we need to teach the students At school, this is how you behave. These are our rules. This is the behavior that's expected of you. When you're at home, you can behave that way. But when you come here, you need to switch. We do that a lot as adults. You know, we behave one way when we're here on school grounds. We may behave a different way at a backyard barbecue. And we know how to switch that behavior back and forth, but sometimes our students don't. Then we need to look at environmental things. So do we have good systems in place? Our discipline policies and procedures is another part of that environmental place. And then we also need to look at our discipline. What are we doing? One of the data sources we can look at is referrals by administrative decision. So for example, we've got all these different things that we can do based on the student code of conduct. As administrators, are we doing all of them? So for example, we looked at data at one school and they gave out-of-school suspension, in-school suspension, student conferences, parent conferences, and detentions. That's all they did. But when you look at data for another school, they're trying a variety of things. Prior to getting to the out-of-school suspension, they're doing things like behavior contracts, social skills instruction, schedule changes, individualized instruction. So they're trying some things to try and change the behavior so it doesn't have to result in out-of-school suspension. And that's what our focus is, trying to change that behavior so that the kids are in school and are being successful.
There was something you said earlier that bothered me because we hear this all the time, and school districts need to do something about it. It sounds like school districts need to solve all the problems in the world these days. But I was glad to hear that you mentioned family and community as something that you look at. I assume socioeconomical challenges, things of that nature, to see if there's any root cause to a particular disproportionality at a school. Do you ever look at data, say from police departments, of whether or not that community behavior out there outside of school is proportional to in school? Because if there is a proportionality there, asking us to solve those problems that exist in the community is a far stretch, and I think it'd be a completely different strategy.
And that's why we do that needs assessment process that I mentioned. That's why we're looking at each individual school's data for the ones that we're tackling for disproportionality, because it's not just a school district, but it's everybody needs to be working on it. And so that's why part of that disproportionality work group, we're bringing in community members involved in that process, because we want to look at multiple data sources. And it's, like you said, it's not going to be one solution for each school. It's really going to be based on what's going on in that particular campus and community that's going to help to solve the issue.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you for your answers.
Yes.
I'm curious to know, and I don't know if this is a question for you or if it's a question for staff, perhaps. We have some schools that are implementing with high fidelity. We have some schools that are implementing with lower fidelity. I will tell you in my experience that schools implementing with low fidelity are doing an enormous amount of damage. Because what we are doing in many instances is, because we feel like we need to have a positive focus, we are rewarding bad behavior. We are frustrating our teachers. We are creating an environment where our teachers do not feel supported by administration because they feel like there are no consequences. So I guess my question is, how do we ensure that all of the schools where we're implementing PBS are implementing with high fidelity? My concern is the last thing that we need to do is to make the situation worse. And I feel like a lot of times that's unfortunately what we're doing. So do we have a game plan to ensure that whatever schools we're implementing in are implementing with high fidelity and have the support, people support, the time support, the resource support, to ensure that they can in fact implement with high fidelity to ensure overall success of the program?
I'll answer that question, then I'm going to ask the district to address some other parts too. But that's part of the action plan that I've talked about that we worked on. And we look at that data, and we definitely look at which are the schools that are not implementing with fidelity. And so some of the things that we've started with, and we've done every year, is those that are not implementing with fidelity is do that booster refresher training, and bringing those schools back and helping to action plan and problem solve around those. Dr. Tommy Kasango is one of the external coaches, and so we've paired him with one of those schools to help bring them up this school year. Jason also meets with the coaches to provide some additional professional development, and we we have targeted those coaches' meetings around the data to hopefully work on those areas of need. I'll let you speak a little bit more, Jason.
And also as a result of not feeling, we want teachers to feel supported. We want by their administrators. So as a result of some of that conversation, that's not the intention. Our intention is to teach kids what we want them to do in order to be successful in school, at home, and in the community, and to be productive adults. That's the goal. As a result of that, what I'm going to start doing next year is really working on schools, helping them monitor and revise their disciplinary action plans. If they're having particular problems with kids throwing erasers or whatever at the teachers, that's not an acceptable behavior that should be tolerated in the classroom. So we need to work on some of those issues and challenges that teachers are facing. So that's just one thing that, in addition to the refresher trainings and coaching meetings that we do provide. So hopefully that helped answer the question.
The other comment that I would like to make, I think data is important. We have to take a look at data. But some of the comments that I have heard from the community are that, or I shouldn't say from the community, from the school level, that they feel like they can't make decisions because their data is being monitored. And so we may still be seeing the exact same behaviors, but we're not doing an office referral, or we're not doing an in-school suspension, or we're not doing an out-of-school suspension because we feel like we're being monitored based on how many of those we are issuing, and so we want to look good, and so we just won't issue them. And so I think we have to, going back to the communication issue that comes up so often, I think it's important that we as a district make sure that we have a very clear communication plan with the schools, the reason that the information is being monitored and the way that it's being used, and the importance of them really presenting genuine data and not altering that data because we want to look good on paper.
And we want genuine data. Regardless of what it looks like at a particular school or in our district, we want genuine data because there's no way to improve unless we know what the problem is. So those are issues that we will address through this process because the goal is to support schools and to support teachers in managing their classrooms and to support kids in learning. And our goal is, regardless of where you are as a school, to assist you, not tell teachers you can't write referrals, because that is not what we're looking for. Referrals are an appropriate thing to do in a classroom when the behaviors are of a nature that you just can't teach. Teachers have to be able to teach, students have to be able to learn. So I appreciate that comment, and we will take that and go back with it because that is not our intention. We want genuine, correct data regardless of what it shows.
Thank you, Dr. Thede. One question for you is, it kind of goes back to the implementation or the usage of PBS throughout the district. I realize on a year-to-year basis there are new principals, there are new APs, there are new faculty and stuff. How are you addressing and how are you delivering something like PBS as an option? How do you get that information and get that information to the principals so that they know that this is available? I see a very low participation rate, obviously, and certainly very low in the high fidelity area. So if this is so good, how are we making sure that we get it out throughout the district and also making sure that our values remain the same across all schools? Because there seems to be some individualized school-based decisions, which is great, but how do we make sure that it's all following the same value system?
Well, you've asked a couple of questions in there, and
And before she answers that, that's going to be our last question, and we can ask more questions because we have agreed to go into a board meeting at 10 o'clock. So whatever you can't answer, we'll have to continue after our time certain meeting at 10 o'clock.
Do you want me to hold or answer first?
Well, it depends on how long your answer
Let
is.
me give one very quick answer.
Okay.
To the question of how do schools know? Mr. Lobley holds informational sessions and invites all schools to those informational sessions. Dr. Martinez comes as well, and they explain the process, explain what it takes to make a PBS a go in a school, and schools have to make decisions from there whether or not this is the right process for them. So I'll answer that question. I think that's the quickest answer right now.
Okay, I know there's going to be some more. Okay, will that be the last one?
For me. I'd like to take Mrs. Belford's comment a step further about communication and request that the board requests that you put something in place that teachers at PBS schools have a direct path of communications back to this team in the event that they are criticized for how they handle a particular situation or they disagree with school administration, that they can communicate with you to understand whether it was right or wrong without reprisal from its school administration. And I think that would help our teachers feel more comfortable as to whether things are working, they're doing it right. So could you establish a method of communication for our teachers?
I think it would help the buy-in process.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we will adjourn the workshop. We'll take a 60-second recess to reset for the meeting. So nobody leave. 60 seconds. We'll see, make sure Karen's on.